Hey, this is Royce Hall. I'm the Director of Business Development here at Level 12. I'm with Matthias Hager today. He is a team lead for one of our development teams. And we want to talk about the difference in development at Level 12. So we often talk about code quality, why that's important. And Matthias actually got to have some hands-on experience here recently with a couple of our clients. They had existing code bases that he was able to drop in on. And it was kind of an eye-opening experience, I think. So, Matthias, why don't you talk to us about the difference of, working in somebody else's Python code and how we emphasize code quality, and what difference does it really make to the end user?
Yeah, so it's most of our projects here are greenfield projects, meaning that we develop them from scratch ourselves. But these last couple opportunities that I've had to go in and work in existing code bases have been very interesting or fun for me to see the different styles of code that other people are writing, and to come in and adapt our own style to them. One of the projects that I worked on was an existing code base built in-house by a development team. And we came into it, it was a small project. We came in to add a new feature to it, but their existing code base had very few tests written for it. So our first step actually was to write tests for their existing code. And the reason we did that was so that when we build new features, we'll know if we're breaking existing things, because it'll have automated tests. Now, these are tests that they're code-based tests that are testing the functionality of specific sections of code. We call them unit tests, and they guarantee that, or they help you guarantee that when you give a input to a section of code, you'll get the same output that you expect every time that it runs with that input. So what I was discovering as I was getting into their code base was that because they lacked these test suites that automatically tested, there were actually things in there that were completely broken that they had never noticed. There were bugs in there and sections of the code that weren't working as they expected them to, simply because they didn't have tests. It was a really good experience for me writing the test beforehand, because if I hadn't gone through and tested what they had in there and seen that those bugs existed, I would have come across them later when we were adding our own new features, and it would have been a more difficult process to track them down and to figure out if it was something that we were writing on top of it that was causing problems, or if it was the existing code that was causing problems. So writing tests really helped us find those problems early and fix them before we went on to new development.
That's interesting. So the tests help you uncover problems that it sounds like they didn't really know they had.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. There was one section of code in particular that stood out that was a function that's supposed to find a profile for a user if it exists, or create it if it doesn't exist. And they're using a database layer there, a third-party tool to interface with the database. And they had not properly read the documentation for that database layer, and the function they were using of it returned a list of users whenever they searched for it. But when they were checking to see if it returned empty, they weren't checking to find an empty list. They were checking to find a null value, which would never happen. It would always return an empty list if no users existed. So their code to create a new user if one doesn't exist was just never, ever going to run. And for whatever reason, they never noticed this problem, or their existing use of the product didn't ever come across this. But with what we were adding on to it, we needed to create a profile for users, and it would have caused a bug for us later if we hadn't caught it right then.
That's interesting. One of the things that people will say about testing from time to time is like it's slow, like it's not as fast. And it sounds like what you're saying is not necessarily that it's faster on the front end, but like it's faster on the back end, and that when you need to go and make an addition, it's going to be a lot easier, and you also know that you're not breaking anything in the process.
Yeah, there's definitely some time saving involved with it, as well as frustration for the developer. The other area where it saves time relates to the other client that we worked with. They were actually a development agency themselves, but they don't do a lot of testing in their work. In lieu of testing, they have a rigid QA process. So they have a dedicated person who goes in and runs through every issue and tests the spec manually against what should be happening there. Which actually, I really think this is a good process, and I think it's a good thing that they do it, but I don't think it's a one-to-one replacement for the automated testing that we do. And part of the reason for that is we're writing tests in code to test the functionality of what's there. And so when we write that test once, it's going to be able to run anytime we make a change. Whereas with the QA person, anytime we make a change, they have to spend time then to go run through their checklist of items for that. So they're spending more time on QA, where our tests are automatically running and are there permanently. They have to do it every time when they make a change.
Okay. So does quality code just mean, we have good tests? Is that all that means?
I don't think that's all it means. That's a big part of it. But there's certainly more to it that could be talked about. Quality code also means that it's easily extensible, meaning you can come in later and build on top of it if you need to, or change it without causing additional problems. It can mean that it's easy to understand. So somebody coming in and looking at an existing code base can get in there and figure out what's happening with minimal effort. It can also mean that there's not a lot of wasted space there. The project that the agency was working on used a template system that they bought from a third-party place to sort of power their front end. And instead of just picking out the pieces that they wanted to use from that enormous template system, they just plopped the whole thing in there. So now they've got this enormous code base of stuff that they're not even using, that is just making the whole thing a sort of a sloppy mess. And it made it really difficult to get in there and figure out what's actually useful, what is actually being used, and what's just boilerplate that they plopped in there.
Okay. So I think that maybe gets at a little bit why we choose Python for our development, doesn't it? Because that's one of the things I hear the developers talking about is, it's very simple and it's, really readable. It's easy to understand. And I think we do a lot with documentation as well of, make sure you leave good notes for the next person, because it might not be you, necessarily doing the development. And we've seen that from time to time with jobs that we've taken where a developer walked away and now nobody knows what's going on. So is that part of the reason why we work with Python?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. Python's easy to understand, easy to read. It's fairly straightforward to work with. I don't think that means that you cannot have bad code base or poor quality code with Python, but I think it definitely sets a good baseline there for quality code.
Great. Well, Matthias, thanks for taking the time to speak with me today. I appreciate it, and I hope you have a great afternoon.
Yeah, thanks. See you, Royce.
See ya.